So Gabon and Sierra Leone.
They are a bit compressed, but here you can see it.
Yeah, actually it's kind of compressed.
Otherwise, I go here.
¿Podemos cambiar a que en el telón se ve PowerPoint y no la pantalla de Zoom? Sí. Por favor. ¿Cómo estás? Que aquí se ve el PowerPoint, porque aquí estamos en el Zoom. Se pierde un poquito de espacio en el computador. Ahí en pantalla completa, ¿no? Ahí sí.
Pero
vamos a subir.
No es importante. Ya empezamos.
Sí. Entonces, 15 seconds. Ya, buenas tardes a todos. Estamos en una nueva sesión de nuestros seminarios académicos y sin Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad del Desarrollo. Y en esta ocasión tenemos un invitado estelar. Y para la ocasión entonces vamos a dejar al doctor Tomás Weitzel, que es su anfitrión, que lo presente, por favor. Gracias, Tomás, por estar aquí con nosotros.
Ya, muchas gracias. Ya tengo el placer de introducir a Martin Robosch, que en Medicina Tropical es un profesor muy conocido en Europa y en todo el mundo. Él viene para ayudarnos como docente en nuestro curso actual de Medicina Tropical y pedimos esta sesión extra sobre sus experiencias como con proyectos científicos en África. Martin es un médico alemán con formación en Alemania y Inglaterra, internista, infectólogo, la especialidad Medicina Tropical, que trabajó y terminó su PhD en Berlín y después en Tübingen, Alemania. Después trabajando también en estos tiempos ya en África, en Gabón, en un centro conocido de malaria, y después trabajó 6 años, creo que, como jefe de un departamento muy grande en Johannesburgo, en Sudáfrica, y después volvió hace 10 años a Europa y ahora es el jefe del Departamento de Medicina Tropical y Medicina del Viajero de la Universidad en Ámsterdam. Un centro muy conocido, grande, y además sigue con sus afiliaciones en África, trabajando en Gabón y también ahora en Sierra Leone con un nuevo centro de investigación. Es un médico clínico, pero además hace mucha investigación clínica con muchos apoyo de muchos PhD students y tiene yo vi hoy día más de casi 600 publicaciones, muchos capítulos en libros, trabaja en muchas revistas de medicina tropical e infectología. Ya, y para no ocupar más tiempo, pido a Martín empezar con su presentación.
Muchas gracias, Thomas. Buenas tardes. I'm about to say here, unfortunately, my active Spanish skills end. Thank you very much for your very kind words, Thomas, and your nice introduction, Francisco. And it's a great honor for me to be here today to share a little bit of the sort of work which we are doing. And I hope I won't be disappointing to the basic scientists among you, because I want to focus a little bit on that sort of work which we undertake with the view to develop capacity and to do as many things as possible which should have a direct impact on the populations we are working with, actually. So, yeah, thanks for the very comprehensive introduction. I thought I'll start with a very, very brief background of the basis of where I work from. And as Thomas already said, my main task is clinical work, and naturally this unfolds for a great part in this center of the University of Amsterdam. It's a usual European-sized university hospital, maybe 1,500 beds, but more work being carried out in outpatients department. Our primary task is to look for the needs of outgoing travelers in the broadest sense, people visiting relatives and friends after having moved to Europe, tourists, business travelers, professional travelers, military staff actually, and then we also see people back at the receiving end when they return ill from the tropics. And this amounts to about 5,000 outpatient contacts per year in non-COVID years, I must say. And of course, we also contribute, we are infectious diseases, internal medicine specialists, we contribute also to the care of the inpatients in infectious diseases. Quite unusual for Europe. This is one of the larger, or the largest, I think, but science doesn't matter that much, but a much larger infectious diseases department than we know them from most other European hospitals, and which is also one of the reasons which attracted me to work there actually. And when asking my predecessor actually why 1/3 of all internal medicine beds would be infectious diseases, and 1/3 of the medical specialists in internal medicine are infectious disease specialists. They said, well, when we merged all these old inner city hospitals, which were not functional any longer, they were built 300 years ago or so, and all the services from Amsterdam were merged to this hospital, they said we simply counted the patients, and half of all internal medicine patients have either a primary or secondary infectious disease diagnosis. And this sort of pragmatism is, I think, relatively typical for the Netherlands, actually. So this is what we see. We see these pre-travelers. We also have a second university hospital in Amsterdam, to which we expanded our services. And we have a couple of specialty polyclinics, including, of course, HIV, which accounts for a large portion of that work. Lyme, echinococcosis polyclinics, this accomplished the thing. And one thing we expanded our services into is that we do have in a European university hospital an enormous amount of immunocompromised patients, heterogeneically immunocompromised, all the post-transplant patients, the vast richness of people who are on biologicals for autoimmune disorders, etc. And we realized actually when we started furnishing them with vaccines which they would be needed for traveling, we realized that many of the post-transplant protocols were not implemented by our surgical colleagues because it's simply out of their area of interest. And we started a very intense line also of research into the immunity, vaccine immunology of the pre- and post-transplant patients, which has nothing to do with traveling. So that's what we do. It's quite it has become over 10, 12 years I'm there, grown relatively big into 60 staff members, maybe 10 physicians, 6 seniors, including myself, and then a couple of rotating physicians, and the remainder are researchers in various stages of their education. Now, apart from the clinical work and, of course, relatively comprehensive teaching activities, our heart lies with clinical research, actually. And it's really mainly clinical research and relatively broad. And the reason for this is simply because we come from a clinical side where you can't make choices and say, I'm only going to see malaria patients because that's what I like most, and the TB patients and the I don't know what have to go to the colleague. No, because we are jacks of all trades in a way, because we see this large mixture of a variety of diseases. But primarily, my main, main origin of my research is malariology. And when I moved to South Africa, the second big mainstay of my work was drug-resistant tuberculosis, actually. And the research we do can be anything from epidemiology, diagnostics, but it's mainly clinical trials for the development of novel drugs and vaccines. For this, we team up with many partners. What you see here in Africa is that we also work in locations in Asia. I do have a PhD in Pakistan who works on cutaneous leishmaniasis, and another one in Vietnam who works on drug-resistant TB. There are one or two projects also in South America. We have started to work in a fairly forlorn area of remote area of Ecuador, where hardly any stately structure exists, which is Sucurios province, close to the Colombian border, where we help mapping infectious and non-infectious diseases because there is hardly any health infrastructure. Thomas and I, we are collaborating on a couple of things, and increasingly so, but my main work is in Africa. What you see here is a bit are PhD projects which I have been involved in with various partners. For example, in Khartoum, we are looking into echinococcal epidemiology and treatment. I had a couple of PhDs from Rwanda, where we are looking into very complex issues, also clinically, not only immunologically, of co-infections between HIV as an underlying condition in many, plus malaria, and then the immune modulatory effects of helmintic infections, which really make pictures extremely complex. And then with colleagues from Zambia, I'm working on shaping national policies in resource-poor areas for translating drug-resistant TB epidemiology in efficient care. And before going to returning to Europe, to my current position, I was, as Thomas already said, head of infectious diseases in Johannesburg 15 years ago. I'm now affiliated with the University of Cape Town, and there it's HIV, tuberculosis, left, right, and center. And in particular, when I started working there 15 years ago, the MNXDR TB crisis was really rife. We had these incredible things like the so-called Tugela Ferry outbreak, where within 2 weeks in 2007 in rural KwaZulu-Natal, in a rural hospital, 52 of 53 HIV-positive TB patients died within 2 weeks due to XDR-TB, and that became, in a way, the mainstay of my work there, where we tried to organize the care for almost 1/4 of the population in Gauteng province around Johannesburg and Pretoria, where I closed a tropical medicine hospital and reopened it as a facility for 270 MNXDR TB patients, and we exclusively, it was full from the first day actually, and these were pioneering days where there was no protocol and where there were no drugs actually, except for old drugs to be repurposed, standard drugs to be escalated in unforeseen dosages to somehow get a grip on this disease actually, and where I also used the opportunity to open a research unit where we can now say proudly in retrospect contributed humbly to the development of novel drugs which are now standard of care. So for young students or for young doctors working now in XDR-TB, we have standard therapies which are far shorter than the 18-20 months what it was until a year ago. So we have new drugs, really new drugs, which is a rarity in infectious diseases. Actually, bedaquiline, delamanid, all these drugs which were emerging over the past 10-15 years. And this is work I'm still conducting in Cape Town. We are looking in particular into complex issues of co-treatment of HIV and tuberculosis, pathophysiology of bloodstream mycobacterial infection. That's a bit what we are pursuing there. But for the past 2-3 years, that work has declined because, like everywhere, everything went, and Chile is no exception. I think this is the only infectious disease where wherever you talk to anybody, we all had the same experience. So every sort of field work ground to a halt because every resource was put into COVID care. The most long-standing workplace I'm working in is in Lambaréné in Gabon. the old hospital where Albert Schweitzer himself worked and died in 1965. And in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the foundation which ran the Schweitzer Hospital went back to the books where Albert Schweitzer said that, and who was for sure not a scientist actually, said, matter of factly, nobody should practice clinical medicine without a research approach, actually, because we always have to question what we are doing, what we are seeing. And he made this remark, which now seems slightly outdated, but he said, as soon as there are more than 2 doctors working in a hospital, they should take a research approach. So as a recently qualified doctor, actually, I went for the first time to Gabon in 1996, where we were 5 or 6, mainly people from overseas, 1 project leader, and then 3, 4, 5 young aficionados who did project there. And I must say, and this is where we are doing it for now in retrospective, in 1996 we were 6 people, of which 2 were local. And by now this research unit has grown out into one of the 4 or 5 significant sub-Saharan African research units with more than 350 people, of which 2/3 to almost 70% are local. And we can proudly say that we now have the first 4 African professors who have joint appointments with the unit where they started training with us 20 years ago at several European universities. So I think, and this is one of the things which I really love with this, is you can, with research, clinical research, you can and should, of course, contribute to drug development, improvement of care. But medical research is such a formidable tool to build capacity and to create structures which far beyond medicine have an enormous impact. So this little town of Lambaréné, for example, has been growing out into a, also into a town which benefits from this 350 highly educated people coming with their families, with many international guests, etc. So with clinical research, one can put places also really on a map, and a certain part of the good reputation of the state of Gabon is now generated through research output and practical changes in clinical medicine, which take their origin there. So for example, there is no single anti-malaria which has not been co-tested in that side. And I think this is something, that's what I'm doing it for. So the latest addition to this map, actually, for me, is Sierra Leone, where I started working when called upon during the Ebola outbreak. I'm training, I do a lot of training also for a special sort of education which is specific for the Netherlands, which is the so-called tropical medicine training, doctor training. The tropical doctors are not academically trained staff, but they are young professionals, usually just finishing medical school, who want to do practical work in the tropics with Physicians Without Borders, with small local hospitals or wheresoever. And part of the training I'm delivering to them is on viral hemorrhagic fevers. And when there was this Ebola outbreak, this massive outbreak evolving in West Africa, almost all health infrastructure was shut down. So with Ebola, the main problem with Ebola is not Ebola itself, but it's the total disruption and destruction of the health systems, because healthcare workers are falling ill, hospitals are becoming sometimes hubs for the distribution of disease, actually. And the biggest killer in an Ebola outbreak is not Ebola, but is, as I said, the total disruption of the health systems. And I'll show you a couple of examples how we try to successfully manage to reopen a secondary level of care hospital within such an outbreak. And I took the opportunity to start building a research unit there. And sorry, I'll give you a couple of practical examples in due course. I'm skipping what I already told you a bit about the work we are doing in Amsterdam, maybe very quickly. Of course, travel medicine is the little brother of tropical medicine. Sometimes there is no overlap, but we use travelers as something very important. We use them as sentinels for evolving epidemiological features which happen anywhere in the world. And very, very often, there are travelers who are the first indicators of an outbreak evolving somewhere, even before the local authorities have seen any cases, noted any cases. So sometimes, for example, we identified as a European network a malaria outbreak in the Dominican Republic, which was not noticed weeks before it became clear what happened in the field. We were amongst the first who saw in the sentinel surveillance networks already the first COVID patients, whereas the epidemic had not really reached the surface or so. And that is a bit of work we are doing. It's pretty, in a way, it's banal. This is not rocket science, actually. It's, in a way, counting patients and connecting dots, and then of course also embarking on more ambitious research projects. But most of this is designed to improve the alertness for ongoing epidemics, for evolving epidemics, and or little local outbreaks. And I think that's a very effective way to do medicine. I'm skipping the details. I just want to show you something also. Travel medicine is a formidable tool because for detecting really, really odd things which otherwise would be going unnoticed, because if we see patients from certain areas, we usually have the privilege, that we are able to escalate diagnostics and to do whatever we think is needed to fish out and to delve deeper into certain phenomena. If you work in a tropical setting, usually your tools will be limited. You will be targeting your work towards saving as many lives as possible with limited resources, with trying to make optimal use of limited resources, but very often you will not be able to really understand what's going on. You will have to do your best from a clinical point of view, but you might not be able to delve deeper and understand certain developments. This is just an example. Some of these things are total rarities, but some, as COVID, can grow out rapidly into something bigger. This is just a case of a young man who traveled from Europe in a remote Indonesian archipelago area. One small island, Ambon, in a huge archipelago, and he did nothing atypical for a tourist. He was just walking on slippery rocks which were overgrown with algae, very wet, humid, actually, and he hurt his ankle. Nothing special. This didn't heal. He went back from his tropical sojourn and was then seen by his general physician, actually, and she thought of a staphylococcal infection, treated, it didn't heal. So then people end up in a university hospital, and to our enormous surprise, nobody would have established that diagnosis. We found a pathogen, Haemophilus ducreyi, which we know from a totally different context. It's a sexually transmitted disease. Now, which bugs are sexually transmitted? It's the tiniest and the most sensible. They need humidity, they need a certain temperature. So these are usually very, very sensible organisms which wouldn't survive outside such a privileged, let's say, ecosystem like the human skin in certain areas of the body. Now, here we found this Haemophilus ducreyi infection in a traveler who didn't even have sexual intercourse. In fact, the guy told us later, if I knew I had a sexually transmittable disease, I would at least have enjoyed some sex, he said. But in the end, and the point I want to make with this rarity is that we are sometimes able with using travelers to understand more about disease epidemiology, which is unknown. This is only the second or third case worldwide described, which shows that certain organisms do have far larger ecosystems than we know. And I like those things. I find them fascinating. This is not rocket science, actually. This is also not rocket science, but I just put on some title of some work which we did. Much of this is really, from a scientific point of view, boring legwork, but something which can have an extremely high impact on clinical practice, actually, and it can change lives also for people. For example, we know that many travelers or many people, and that goes beyond travelers, actually, they lose their immunity, which they acquire through vaccination against certain diseases once they get either a bone marrow transplant or they start receiving biologicals which suppresses their immune system, etc. And we have a whole line of investigations where we look into what do we have to do to protect those people in an optimal way. For example, are there any advantages in dose adaptations in doing other combinations of vaccines? Can we trigger safe immune responses in people who are otherwise not being able to rebuild an immune response? We are also looking into some, and this is in a way totally irrelevant for affluent settings, and I would Chile count as affluent setting in that case as well. For example, we are looking in certain vaccines, yellow fever, rabies. There are a couple of antigens which we probably do not either have to use for revaccinations or where we can spare regimes when administering them. In a travel medicine affluent setting, it doesn't really matter whether you vaccinate against yellow fever or not, or whether you immunize your rabies patient or your traveler or your whatsoever resident in a highly endemic area twice or thrice. But on a global scale, this has an enormous impact because these are expensive and rare and difficult to produce antigens. So, for example, if there is a yellow fever outbreak in Brazil or so, threatening to turn from a sylvatic cycle outbreak to an urban cycle outbreak where you don't even need intermediate hosts or primary hosts, rodent hosts actually, to propagate the infection, where the disease spreads rapidly, even in a half pre-vaccinated population, because the virus is directly taken up by a mosquito and then put to the next patient, actually, where, as we see almost every year, large campaigns of vaccination and revaccinations are needed. These antigens are very, very scarce, and very often, like with yellow fever, if we could get away with administering only 1/10 to 1/5 of the antigen to yield the same immune response, we could vaccinate for the same buck. Actually, we could 5 times as many banks, so to say. And we experiment a lot with intracutaneous, intradermal application of vaccines, which has a sound immunological basis, because matter of factly what we do with all our vaccines, whether we put them into the subcutaneous or whether we inject deeply into a muscle, in the end we want to reach Langerhans cell type cells, which present the antigen then to other cells. And there is no layer in our body, tissue layer, where we have higher concentration of those Langerhans cells. But that is only a sidestep. I think I skip one or two of those things, but a lot of the work which we do is, this was work of or 2 PhDs actually in Rwanda, is we might look at direct pathogen-host interactions, but then we very frequently look also at the consequences of a disease or combination of disease on societal factors, actually. So we have a lot of interest in malaria, a lot of interest in anemia, which sometimes is a prerequisite for people not to become more ill. So we know that, of course, all the beta and alpha thalassemia, sickle cell disease, etc., to a certain extent protect against severe malaria, but on the other hand, they also make people prone to anemia. They interact with other factors, and we take usually once we have done some, let's say, really disease management oriented research, we sometimes try to team up with anthropologists, with other local very important people to try to understand how can we translate this work directly into better healthcare in those places, actually. This is Lambaréné in central Gabon. Actually, this is the densest rainforest which we still have on Earth. So there is very little, there is exploitation, but we cannot compare it to what's happening to the South American rainforest. It's really, really dense, and Gabon is to a certain extent, privileged country in Central Africa because due to offshore oil, actually the state is relatively wealthy, and that helped them to put more than 80% of the state of the country really under strict protection, actually. Now, that is a very specific ecosystem. Here you see the Ogre River, for European standards, a massive river, of course not in a continent which houses the biggest river on Earth, but the Ogre is a gigantic river. It's more than 1.5 kilometers broad there, and it's still 200 kilometers from the Atlantic coast. At one of the banks of the river lies the research center at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, and this is part of this hospital, like one of many thousand in the tropics. And there we started. Most of the work is really also not satisfying from a scientific point of view, but we want to contribute to disease pathophysiological understanding, etc. We want to improve treatments, but in many, many places we need to lay very banal foundations. So, for example, HIV care is by now in most places on Earth, or in many places, coming at least with less stigma than 20, 30 years ago. But in many places, and Central Africa is one of those, one would not have even been able to mention HIV as a disease openly in discussions with ministries of health. And many, many years of legwork, of continuously trying to make things discussable, actually, are necessary before you create a basis for ambitious research and then bigger jumps forward. So it took us a couple of years, actually, to be officially allowed to deliver HIV care. Now, 10, 15 years down the line, it's not a problem any longer. In the whole country, you have HIV care, etc. But we were forced, or we really needed to do basic work like understanding how many people do have HIV, what is the co-infection rate with tuberculosis, etc. And it took many, many years to lay the foundations to do more ambitious work, such as looking into the extremely complex interplay. And I'm not an immunologist by training, but we are teaming up, of course, with relevant people where a widely neglected field in medicine is that we look very often into the interplay between infectious disease and non-infectious conditions. We also look into the interplay. TB and HIV is a classic, actually. But it becomes so complicated if an HIV patient who has also TB develops malaria and at the same time has his immune system or its immune system modified through certain helmintic infections, which shift a Th1 answer to a Th2 response. And honestly, yeah, there is still lots of work to do to understand and unravel these things. And tropical areas are ideal for this because there you do have very often 3, 4, or sometimes 5 concomitant infectious diseases at a time. Then really banal things which we do in clinical practice. You need very basic techniques, might not be well established in areas where you do not have a radiology department and not 5 internists, etc. So we try to find ways how to apply simple low-cost techniques which have an enormous clinical impact, and how to do this in a way that you can do it at a certain level without having a lot of specialists in it. So one hobby horse of mine was to facilitate the development of POCUS, so the primary on-site use of applied very focused on particular questions, ultrasound techniques to improve the diagnosis of, for example, and in particular tuberculosis, pulmonary and non-pulmonary. And we also use these techniques to see whether we can, for example, use ultrasound to determine the fluid needs, for example, for a malaria patient, which is totally different from what we do in the management of sepsis or dengue, where we put as much fluid, this is changing, but where we for many years put as much fluid as we could into a patient, which we called aggressive fluid resuscitation, which would be a technique which kills your malaria patient, because through the disruption of the epithelial functions of almost every tissue due to the fact that the malaria parasites, falciparum at least, clog up the capillaries and disrupt every cellular function, people who would be aggressively rehydrated would immediately go into pulmonary edema. We are trying techniques where we look at lung ultrasound as a much more sensitive method than chest X-ray to detect early lung edema developing, for example, in malaria patients. Very primitive things. Then also rarities, rare diseases, which are extremely debilitating and which have an enormous impact on the very few who are infected. So, for example, there are a couple of endemic mycoses, which are, and I mean, South America is also one of those areas in the world, much more than Central Africa, where we do have a lot of difficult to treat, very often also difficult to diagnose deep tissue mycosis. And this was an attempt, for example, to enable clinicians to easily diagnose the correct deep tissue mycosis without having access to pathology, without having access to sophisticated stains, without having the possibility to pick the brains of experts in that field, which are very often not existing. Then there is this, I think for me, it's this is really a part of the field which I take a strong interest in, which is to conduct or contribute here in a very humble way as one partner of many actually to novel drug developments. And for example, we have seen over the past 10-15 years, I think 3 examples for a real acceleration of just want to check how much time is here. A real acceleration of clinical development. The first time I saw the acceleration of what usually takes 10 to 15 years, namely taking a drug lead or target, which you will have sought out on level 1 or level -1 of this fantastic new facility, which you give to us as clinicians and say, do something good with it. And then we can talk in 15 years again, whether we managed or whether the drug development failed. And I have seen this 3 times. The first one was in Southern Africa, where we had these new drugs which were so desperately needed, bedaquiline, melamanid, actually as backbone drugs of what is now the standard treatment of XDR-TB, where we have the difficult situation that differently from, for example, malaria, where you test a new drug against the gold standard and either it works or it doesn't. You know, after 3 days, either the patient has no malaria any longer or he does. Either the drug works or it doesn't, and you can compare it with the other. But with TB, you have this problem that every new drug would be added to 5 or 6 others. Now, how do you tease out which effect in this toxic cocktail this drug has, and how do you tease out which adverse effects are due to the underlying condition and its complications or to any of the other 5 drugs? So extremely complex protocols. Still rare disease like XDR-TB, and then how do you try to develop this into a drug through all the 3 clinical trial phases, where in the end you need at least 2,000 to 3,000 patients in a good phase 3 trial actually, and many corners needed to be cut to enable those drugs ever to reach the clinical field. There was an understanding that it's simply impossible to do a clinical phase 3 study because we would never find 2,000 to 3,000 patients in a reasonable time frame, yet these drugs were desperately needed. And then people came to the understanding that this would be the first drugs ever registered without phase 3 clinical trials, actually with the understanding that every single patient would receive these drugs would for years be part of large phase 4 studies. That was amazing, an amazing experience. And the next one was the development, I was privileged to take part in, was the development or the further development of the Ebola vaccines, which we now have. And the problem with clinical trials is that you need 2 or 3 prerequisites to do them properly. The first one is very clear, you need the political will and the funding to see this through. But there is something much more banal. What do you need for a clinical trial? And you need sites, actually. You need to do your trials where you have a critical mass of highly trained specialists who are able to do clinical trials. So that confines you usually to university hospitals or big research centers. But there's one other essential thing. What do you need to develop a drug against a certain condition? Which is so banal, we don't even know what you need. Patients, exactly. Without patients, you cannot test a drug. And Ebola is one of the few diseases where we have an animal model which translates 1-to-1 to the situation in man. So when we have somebody testing new drugs in a murine malaria model, we can always discuss in how far you can translate the pathophysiology of Plasmodium berghei in a mouse to the disease, the pathophysiology seen in man. It's very limited. But we have monkey models, actually, where with extremely few monkeys, actually, and very few animals, 4 to 5 animals, we can really tease out whether a drug or a vaccine works or not, because it's 1-to-1 what we see in man. So when the big West African outbreak hit, and you knew there were never Ebola outbreaks more afflicting more than 50, 100 patients. But when the disease emerged up from December 2013 in West Africa, in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, in the end 28,000 people were afflicted, which is not a lot if you compare to other diseases, but quite an awful lot, because, as I said, the health systems in all 3 countries were devastated. But all of a sudden, there was also the need and the urge to move these drug developments to the field. And again, very innovative ways to test these drugs in an ethically responsible way were developed. The first studies were very easy. And what was remarkable here with the phase 1 studies is that a political will was there on WHO level to see this drug development through while the outbreak was going. And I've never seen this before, and it was very stressful times, but whereas it takes usually months to develop research protocols, to gain funds, to get the approvals, to get the teams together, it took us 3.5 weeks from the first call from WHO and the company behind that vaccine actually to, from scratch, really to include the first patient in the clinical trials. 1.5 months later, the results were available and informed the phase 2 trial, so that we really managed as a global community to see the development of 3 Ebola vaccines through within a couple of months, actually. And I found that extremely remarkable, actually. However, many of things of which we are doing are far less about if you want to use them. Many people talk about the magic bullet when it comes to an ideal drug, an ideal vaccine. So we formulate it should work this way, it should be cheap, it should be 100% effective, etc., etc. It should have no adverse effect. That's what we call the magic bullet, an ideal tool. But very often, clinical medicine is not about the bullets, it's about the guns, actually. And it's about very primitive things. Even with the best vaccine, actually, it can't work when your health infrastructure doesn't work. And even when you have fantastic, brilliant antimalarial combinations, you will still have people dying from it. Just as one random example, when half of the medication which is sold over the country, over the counter in the country, is fake, is substandard, is either deliberately faked or suffers from flaws such as incorrect storage, etc., etc. So this is another part of research where I think it's very, very important to do this. And as an example, just as one example, we did a trial. This is a very hot topic also, counterfeit medicines, actually. And this is also a plaidoyer for having the stamina to also distribute good news. Very often, if we work in a particular area in medicine, we live from bad news. So we are tending to exaggerating because we find it important to tackle the area or to tackle echinococcosis or whatsoever. And in our proposals which we write, we will never err on the low side. We will always have, and without bad intentions, we will always tend to make a problem bigger than it is. We went to Gabon and we did some mystery shopping all over the country where not recognizable as healthcare workers, we bought, our local co-workers bought malaria drugs off the counter. And the common story was that in almost every country, in tropical countries, tropical regions, many of these drugs are substandard or not okay. Actually, we found, to our surprise, we must honestly say, that almost 100% of all drugs, at least developmentally available in this country, were absolutely up to the standard of care, actually. And when trying to understand that, sometimes you will have Gabon, for example, is a country, and this is just a random example, where drug purchasing is really strictly controlled, where they only enter the country through 2 or 3 authorized channels, state control. Whereas in some other areas, this might not be the case, and every public person might go and purchase drugs and from any source which defines us. Just a positive example. I think I'm skipping a couple of those things. We also take great pleasure in, I think this is specific to tropical medicine people. We take a weird interest in absolute rarities. We are very happy if we discover diseases outside of their area where you expect them to be. And very often, there's a nice example for why it's good that COVID is over. Some things take an interesting turn when you start chatting to your neighbor and when you start talking to your colleague who works on something different. And one of my colleagues in Amsterdam one day came and said, I'd really like to work together, actually. So what can we do? And he said, I said, well, what are you working on? Of course, I knew. He said, myelodoses. I said, I work in Gabon. Then we said, well, let's look for myelodoses in Gabon, because it's an Asian disease, actually, confined to Asia, as we thought. But there have been reports of this disease very, very few reports from Madagascar to Nigeria in West Africa. And if you draw a line between Madagascar and Nigeria, you will end up in Gabon, actually. So we thought there might be no reason to assume that if you have a disease in two parts of the continent, why it's not there in the middle. And what we did is that we did state-of-the-art trials where we tried to isolate the bug from the soil. Actually, we analyzed the soil and went to those areas where the composition of the soil was identical with the soil composition in Asia where we find the disease. And we changed our laboratory routine. If you want to look for melioidosis burkholderia, then you have to cultivate your blood plates at 41 degrees and not at 37 degrees. And if you want to discover such a bug, it's a pseudomonad actually, but usually you stop at that level, and you have to do additional tests, and then all of a sudden, if you start doing something completely out of area, but really look hard, we were able to identify burkholderia not only in the soil but also in patients. And I do believe we are coming to an end. This is just. Do we have some more minutes? No, we don't. We rather want some discussion, actually.
I would take 3 to 5 minutes in order to have some questions.
Yeah, okay. Okay, then let's see. I'll skip the TB story in Gabon that I have already done. Actually, maybe just very quickly, for much of this work, you need to be in a place for rather long. When I started doing the work in Gabon, it was all malaria, and then I moved on to another position in South Africa, but was asked and was interested in continuing working. So in the end, we transported the work which I was doing in South Africa to Gabon, where we had no TB infrastructure. Actually, there was one tuberculosis laboratory in the whole country, but the only TB microbiologist actually had died from tuberculosis, actually. So there was no infrastructure in the whole country. And we started very primitively to set up a laboratory for tuberculosis in a garage on the now this, to cut a long story short, it took us 15 years to develop this laboratory, actually, and to our own surprise, we unearthed a multi-drug resistance epidemic in Gabon, which is worse than what we see in South Africa, actually. So we have 12–13% of isolates which are rifampicin resistant, which is indicative of multi-drug resistance. And we were promoted to, now we are the National Reference Center for Tuberculosis. We established a treatment unit for drug-resistant TB, and last week we published the first 10 years or 8 years compilation of resistance data from the whole country. This is not rocket science, this is just facilitating things. But I must say I take pride in this because it means that with a multidisciplinary team, and if you invest for many, many years, I think one can make real changes. And this work is going to persist. And I do believe it's time to stop. There is no time to take you to Sierra Leone, actually, for more detailed work on Ebola, but I think that's enough. And I thank you very much. I hope there are some questions.
Well, thanks so much, Martin. Si alguien tiene preguntas en español, tal vez podemos ayudar a traducir. ¿Alguien tiene preguntas en la audiencia?
If I may comment,
Please.
the idea that it's not the magic bullet, but the gun is terrific, and it's very much appreciated.
Thank you. Now, I think you need both things. So another example, which I couldn't show you, is I think it's great to have new drugs and sophisticated diagnostics, but you need to get the basics right. So one example is, if you are interested and if there is a time, when we got this task to get the MDR-XDR-TB situation in Johannesburg under control. We thought we did a great job. We I had one central unit in a highly centralized province where all the patients should come. We had the diagnostics in place, and then all of a sudden, after a couple of months, we realized that only half of the patients diagnosed ended up in our facility. And then we did some very, very primitive things, which which you can't really call research, but we went to the health facilities where the patients surfaced. And then we figured out that some of the nursing and doctor staff simply didn't know which number to call when to refer a patient. Some of the patients were not referred because the ambulances had no air in the tires, etc. And these primitive things, which you need to address those, and otherwise you can invent as many brilliant therapies or so if you can't deliver them. And I think this is something which we recognize in every health system. This is a very extreme example, but I think we have them all. We do the same in Amsterdam, actually. You really need to see how to optimize the basic things. So your doctors, for example, in Amsterdam, we have this very primitive example that, of course, we can diagnose malaria within minutes or so, but you still have to think about it. And our problem, always out of hours, is that patients arrive in the accident and emergency department. And although it's part of the training that the doctors there who toil there and try to get all these patients under control, that as soon as there is somebody from the tropics, they need to call us directly so we can negotiate and discuss upfront which bloods to take, and not to call us 3 to 4 hours later, actually, and then start doing this. And you have this here as well. I think it's very nice to engage in basic research or in novel drugs, etc. But it's always good to get the basics right and to make sure everybody knows the right phone numbers and things. And this is also research, I think we need to do. Sorry for the long monologue.
Any more questions?
Yeah, it looks like the epidemiology of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is very different in Africa. Is that
Yes.
This is what is your explanation for that?
This is an extremely interesting topic, actually. And of course, working in Africa, we got a lot of those questions. And I thought the best thing would be to talk to my African friends and colleagues. So we did a survey, actually, and from North Africa to South Africa. And the basic answer was by everybody, we don't really 100% understand. But there are a couple of factors. Firstly, it is certainly true that there is a certain level of underdiagnosis. Yeah? That's one thing. But we do have an extremely young population. Yeah? In the Netherlands, 60% of the population is older than 45 years. In Sierra Leone, 60% of the population is younger than 15 years. That's one difference. The second thing is, I do believe, and many do, that the immune system modulation, if you do have a helminthic infection, plays an incredible role. You get an entirely different immune response to many different bugs. If you have an underlying condition which doesn't do any visible harm, maybe you have a slight itching here and there, or a slight anemia or so, but if you have a systematic immune response shift from, let's say, a Th1 to a Th2 response, so a different response to, and remind you, the first phase of a COVID infection is about the inoculum and how high your viremia is. But up from day 3 or day 4, it's the host pathogen battlefield which determines your outcome. And I think genetic factors play a role. However, also social factors play a role. There are ideas that whether you've been vaccinated with BCG might modulate your response to COVID, etc. And there are 1,000 factors, and many of them apply to Africa. But if you then go from Africa to Brazil, then you have a population structure in some places which is almost identical, but where many more people succumb to the infection. So To cut a very long story short, I think most explanations fall short, and it's so multifactorial that it's very difficult to determine. It's also that I work in the 3, 4, 5 African locations which I know intimately. And in South Africa, the epidemic is precisely the same as in Europe, yeah? Even worse. And then you have West Africa, where in Sierra Leone, the area where we work, it's hit by Ebola, it's hit by Lassa fever. We expected a disaster, actually. So we tried, in the absence of intensive care structures, we built rapidly infrastructure to cater for people who needed oxygen. And we had these empty units, which never saw a single patient, actually. And probably also many people might have died at home, and we might not have seen them. So it's very, very difficult to come up with a good sometimes. But there is one thing which I would like to mention, if I'm allowed, and this is the difference in vaccination rates. And I think there is completely correct. There are many claims and many people who say the vaccines were not fairly shared, and this is totally correct. But we must also be very, very honest. In many parts of Africa, the vaccination rate is 10, 15, 20%. And if we talk to, that's my own experience, if we talk to my African colleagues, they say, no. We couldn't have vaccinated 100% actually, but we could have vaccinated easily 50 or 60%. But people do not want it. So this is something we are not honest about, because it sounds a bit politically incorrect, but it's vaccine hesitancy is not a topic which afflicts 20-30% of our societies, but it's also widespread in many parts of Africa. But this is totally different. If you look at the epidemic, then people might be right. Another aspect which I would like to bring forward, and I left the South American perspective, but I must say, if there is any sort of an outbreak, nobody has to try to explain a lot of things in Africa. From one day to another, airports would have had travel restrictions. You had screenings in place. Let them be effective or ineffective. But what we saw in Europe, in many parts of Europe, was completely irresponsible. Like in our major hub in Schiphol, the big airport, which was kept open for economic reasons, actually, there were no controls, nothing at all for many months. And I think this COVID is so difficult when it comes again to simple questions like, why look the epidemic so different in Europe from Africa or so? Yeah, it's so multifactorial, biological things, approaches, and even in Europe. I don't know how it was in South America, but the Netherlands handled the epidemic completely differently from what the Belgian neighbors did, what the French neighbors did, what the German neighbors did. Actually, in one country it's masks. Yeah, in one country it was masks. In another country it was mainly hand washing. In one country it was extreme restrictions. In other it was leisure, and I don't know. Maybe it was the same in South America, but
here was everything.
So you were very strict.
All of the above.
Yeah. Which is
yes,
we need to stop.
I know you're running on a tight schedule, so let's give him a last round of applause.
Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot.
Muchas gracias a todos y nos vemos en el próximo seminario académico. Gracias.